Hello, my name is Raymond Lombardi. I'm a family nurse practitioner student at Northwest Nazarene University. This is a presentation on Sister Callista Roy's adaptation model for the Advanced Practice Nursing Theory class. So this is my thesis about this presentation. Primary care nurse practitioners will see a range of illnesses, conditions, and diseases in the practice setting. And to facilitate and improve diagnosis, treatment, and patient outcomes, the integration and use of a nursing theory is vital for the practice for a new family nurse practitioner, simply because most of the time our experiences are going to be more limited. So one excellent nursing theory that I plan on using in my practice is Roy's adaptation model. So Roy's adaptation model provides a humanistic, holistic, and Christian approach to patient care, and I believe that its philosophical assumptions, theoretical assumptions, main concepts, and basic tenets provide an excellent framework in diagnosing and treating patients in the primary care setting. So a little bit of biography about Sister Callista Roy, and this woman was just simply amazing. She was born in Los Angeles, California on October 14, 1939. And an important transition point for her was in 1958. She became a member of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Cornadellet, and I hope I pronounced that right. This is important because it is really an integral part of the basis of her development of the Roy adaptation model, which has a very humanistic religious overview that fits very well with the Christian world viewpoint. And we'll get into that a little bit more later. In 1964, she had, actually in 1963, she got her nursing degree, and then in 1964 began work as a pediatric staff nurse at one of the major hospitals in Los Angeles. And this is a real important time for her because even though she was still a relatively new nurse, she was already thinking of and looking at patterns and systems relating to how people adapted. And that was definitely the researcher part of her coming out. And one of the things she did working as a pediatric nurse is she was looking at the amazing resiliency of the children she cared for and their ability to adapt to major physical and psychological changes that they were experiencing by whatever disease process they had and being hospitalized. It was at this time she began to develop the future Roy adaptation model. This is really where the basics of it all began. In 1966, she developed her adaptation model in a seminar with fellow theorist Dorothy E. Johnson. So a little bit about her education. I touched on her first degree. So in 1963, she earned a BSN from Mount St. Mary's College in Los Angeles. In 1966, she received her Master's of Nursing from the University of California, Los Angeles. And then in 1973, earned a master's degree in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. And finally, in 1977, earned a PhD in sociology at the University of California, Los Angeles. The sequence of all these various degrees and her elevation into higher levels of education, especially resulting in the PhD and especially in sociology, I think certainly played significant roles in the development of the adaptation model. And her feelings on how humans interact, how they need each other, how they need to love each other, all come to play in that model. So in 1968, her alma mater, Mount St. Mary's, adopted her adaptation model as a philosophical foundation for their nursing curriculum. And they were the first of many because this adaptation model has now been out there for over 50 years and has been widely adapted across the nursing profession, not just educationally, but in nursing practice. She worked as a professor and chairperson at Mount St. Mary's, as well as a professor at the University of Portland until 1983. And then from 1983 to 1985, she basically became a clinical nurse scholar in neuroscience and joined the Robert Wood Johnson postdoctoral fellowship at the University of California in San Francisco. She has been a resident nurse theorist at Boston College School of Nursing, and we're just kind of incrementally going through her timeline. In 1987, she became a charter member of the Nursing Research Studies section, which is a division of the National Institutes of Health. In 1989, she received a Fulbright senior scholarship to study in Australia. And if you know anything about how difficult it is to be chosen for a Fulbright scholarship, that should give you some kind of hint of how amazing and capable and brilliant this woman was. In 1991, she established the Boston-based Adaptation Research in Nursing Society, later called the Roy Adaptation Association. She received the Martha E. Rogers Award from the National League of Nursing, and she has been awarded so many things from the nursing profession, and all well warranted, I can tell you. In 1999, the Sigma Theta Tau International published the Roy Adaptation Model-Based Research, which is 25 years of contributions to nursing science. In 2013, she published her new middle range theory, which was an evidence-based perspective on nursing practice. In 2007, the American Academy of Nursing named her a living legend. In 2010, she was one of the 10 inaugural inductees into the Sigma Theta Tau International Nurse Researcher Hall of Fame. In 2016, the Roy Adaptation Model celebrated its 50th anniversary, and the Roy Adaptation Association at that point turned 25. So this model has been in effect for over 50 years and has had a profound influence on much of the nursing profession and practice. In 2017, she retired from the Connell School faculty that was with Boston College and returned to California. So let me give you an overview of the Roy's adaptation model. So it views a person as an adaptive system in constant interaction with the internal and external environments. The environment is the source of a variety of stimuli that either threaten or promote the person's unique wholeness, and I would add health. The person's major task is to maintain integrity in the face of these environmental stimuli. So integrity is the degree of wholeness achieved by adapting to changes in needs. And that's really, as things start hitting us, how do we adapt to basically meet our needs as human beings? So the coping mechanism for her model is adaptation. And central to Roy's theoretical model is the belief that adaptive responses support health, which is defined as a state and a process of being and becoming integrated and whole as a human being. So there's two major influences that led Sister Callista Roy to develop Roy's adaptation model. So I touched on this briefly, and I'll go into a little more depth. So in 1958, she became an avowed sister of the St. Joseph of Carondelet. So the importance of this decision can't be understated, as it points to her belief in a Christian viewpoint, love for her fellow man, and a desire to care for them in God's name. The Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet are a very old order formed in the 16th century by a Jesuit priest. So their motto speaks to their beliefs, and it goes like this: as the world changes, our answer remains simple: love of God and neighbor without distinction. And love is a very vital part of that, and I believe that Callista Roy had that as part of her adaptation model. So their mission is to form loving relationships with ourselves, with God, within community, church, society, and all creation. And they work towards this mission through ministries of prayer, direct service, consciousness raising, and systemic change. They are definitely at the forefront of social justice measures across the board. So this is the order that Callista Roy became an avowed sister of in 1958. And I believe that her belief in God and the tenets of this group had a profound impact on her development of Roy's adaptation model. So the second major influence that eventually led to the adaptation model was her experiences as working as a new nurse in 1964. And I touched on this earlier, so I won't go too much in depth on this, but the gist of it is being around very ill, sick children on a pediatric unit that, where children do not thrive when they're ill. And what she found and what she was amazed of is that even in the face of major physical and psychological changes, the children were extremely adaptive and were able to overcome a number of barriers that would have impacted their ability to return to any point of health. So an important consideration of this study, or this point, I should say, is that Miss Roy really exhibited a researcher's mindset. And unless you've done research, it's hard to understand that. But her mind, really from the very beginning of her education, was very geared towards research and eventually turned that into the ability to be a humanistic theorist. So this is a picture of Roy's adaptation model. And you'll notice it's based on human adaptive systems and human systems in general. And you'll have the stimuli coming in from one point. You have coping processes for physiological, physical self, self-concept, group identity, interdependence, and role function. And what you see on the far side is behavior, and it is our adaptation to behaviors that have reacted to stimuli that are a big point of her model. So her philosophical assumptions on this, and there are several of these, are very important. Persons have a mutual relationship with the world and God. Human meaning is rooted in an omega point convergence of the universe. God is intimately revealed in the diversity of creation and is the common destiny of creation. Persons use human creative abilities of awareness, enlightenment, and faith to really enhance human beings, and persons are accountable for the process of deriving, sustaining, and transforming the universe. And I can tell you, after looking at the website for the St. Joseph Sisters of Carondelet, this is absolutely a major philosophical underpinning of their approach to God, love, fellow human beings, and life. So I believe her beliefs are very much derived from the humanistic approach taken by this order. And it's really just that function of their belief in God and their determination to love God and their neighbor and fellow man without any distinction. For the Sisters of St. Joseph, their love implies the unity of all people and all creation. One citation they had on there was Jesus' great prayer for his followers, that they all may be one. That's John 17:21, which is the root of their work of loving unity. And I believe that is absolutely reflected in Roy's adaptation model. So there are 9 scientific assumptions that can be derived from reviewing Roy's adaptation model. Systems of matter and energy progress to higher levels of complex self-organization. Consciousness and meaning are constitutive of person and environmental integration. Awareness of self and the environment is rooted in thinking and feeling. Human decisions are accountable for the integration of the creative process. Thinking and feeling mediate human action. That's that adaptation type of theme that goes through this. System relationships include acceptance, protection, and fostering interdependence. Persons and the earth have common patterns in integral relations. Persons and environment transformations are created in human consciousness. And integration of human and environment meanings result in adaptation. So she also, one of the things that I found as I did my research on her and some of the developments and thinking beyond her theory, is she also had cultural assumptions built into this. So experiences within a specific culture will influence how each element of her model is expressed when a person comes under stimuli. And within a culture, there may be a concept that is central to the culture and will influence some or all of the elements of her model to a greater or lesser degree. Cultural expression of the elements of Roy's model may lead to changes in practice activities such as a nursing assessment. And as Roy's model elements evolve within a cultural perspective, implications for education and research may differ from experience in the original culture. And a lot of this really stems, again, if you think about the theme of adaptation, even in cultures that are not typical to the United States, we're talking immigrants and that sort of thing, the effect of their culture on Roy's model and then their response to Roy's model can elicit changes within that cultural aspect, certainly for individuals and certainly for larger groups at times. So there are 10 explicit assumptions for Roy's adaptation model. So she believes a person is a biopsychosocial being. Person is in a constant interaction with the changing environment. To cope with the changing world, persons use both innate and acquired mechanisms which are biological, psychological, and social in origin. Health and illness are inevitable dimensions of a person's life, and to respond positively to environmental changes, the person must adapt. And the person's adaptation is a function of the stimulus he is exposed to and his adaptation level. And the person's adaptation level is such that it comprises a zone indicating the range of stimulation that will lead to a positive response, which is really the best outcome because a positive response is going to be towards health. So the person has 4 modes of adaptation, which are the physiologic needs, self-concept, role function, and interdependence. Nursing accepts the humanistic approach of valuing other persons, opinions, and viewpoints, and interpersonal relations are an integral part of nursing. There is a dynamic objective for existence with ultimate goal of achieving dignity and integrity for every person. So these are the explicit assumptions in her model. There are also 4 implicit assumptions. A person can be reduced to parts for study and care. Nursing is based on causality. Patients' values and opinions are to be considered and respected. A state of adaptation frees an individual's energy to respond to other stimuli. So once you get past the philosophical and theoretical assumptions regarding Roy's adaptation model, we move from there into really the main concepts and that meta-paradigm viewpoint that really drives this model. So the main concepts of RAM, and that is Roy's adaptation model, excuse me, include an individual as an adaptive system, the stimuli from the environment, and that's internal and external environment, health as an outcome of adaptation, and the goal of nursing. And the goal of nursing is very important here, especially for us as family nurse practitioners, because we are promoting adaptation and health. So the main argument for keeping the main concepts and the meta-paradigm of Roy's adaptation model from my perspective, because one of the things that has been evaluated is making changes in the model, and I think this model needs essentially to be left alone. It is simplistic and yet complex, and it literally fits with the nature of human beings and how we function, act, and respond. So the 4 main concepts of Roy's adaptation model intrinsically fit the meta-paradigm of this nursing theory and should be kept as is. The primary argument for keeping the meta-paradigm in place is that it provides the basis of the overall structure and function for Roy's adaptation model. Changing, adding, or subtracting any of the four main concepts would critically alter the basis for the overarching theme that begins with the human being, the person, as an adaptive system. So over the course of our lives, every person is subject to a host of varied internal and external environmental stimuli that must be addressed on a daily basis. Our ability to cope with and adapt to these stimuli will determine whether we maintain a state of health or succumb to illness and disease. While this is just one aspect of the multitude of changes, coping measures, and adaptations we make as human beings, from the standpoint of Roy's adaptation model, the outcome of good health holds a primary result point. And it is really when you think about it from that perspective is why I believe that this adaptation model needs to be kept as is and not altered. So this is a continuation of that argument. So nurses, whether they are staff nurses in a hospital or a doctor's office or a family nurse practitioner providing primary care, are a critical component of this adaptation model as we facilitate and promote adaptation of our patients towards health. So removing any of the four main concepts of Roy's adaptation model would essentially cripple its functionality. At the same time, adding additional components would take away from the simplicity, functionality, and capability of this meta-paradigm. Roy's adaptation model works because it provides a humanistic perspective to how human beings respond to stimuli and points to the necessity of adaptation as a critical component to maintaining health. From a nursing perspective, the four main concepts of Roy's adaptation model provide the framework for us to diagnose, assess, examine, and provide treatment of the patient as a whole, with the goal of promoting the patient's health and well-being. Overall, the characteristics of the main concepts of Roy's adaptation model are interrelated, logical in nature, relatively simple yet generalizable, can be the basis for a hypothesis that can be tested. It contributes to and assists in increasing the general body of knowledge, especially for the nursing discipline. It can be utilized by practitioners to guide and improve their practice. It is consistent with other validated theories, laws, and principles, and just as importantly, it is testable and has been tested repeatedly in a healthcare setting. So this is a bit about the comparison of Roy's adaptation model and a Christian worldview, and I touched on this briefly, but this is an important factor. The four main components of Roy's adaptation model intrinsically fit with the Christian worldview from the perspective of nurses loving and caring for our fellow man. As we discussed in the prior slide before, Roy's adaptation model rests on a humanistic approach to caring for our fellow man with a Christian intent. And that is super important because that fact gets missed, I think, a lot of times when you look at the research. The basis for this theory is that all of us have a mutual relationship with God, our world, and each other, either directly or indirectly, and this relationship is based on love, unity, and caring. While the Christian worldview is primarily based on biblical theories, statements, and mandates, the very basis of the Bible goes to God's love for man and his willingness to sacrifice his only Son that we could be forgiven our sins. God's love for each of us is a primary tenet of the Bible, and regardless of interpretations by various religious and figures and religions themselves, it continues to be at the very core of the Bible and Christian worldview. God's love ties Roy's adaptation model directly to the Christian worldview and the Bible. This perspective is derived from an understanding of the background and Christian beliefs of Callista Roy, who developed this model. I discussed her Christian beliefs earlier, but it is something that if you'd like to look at, it is an important factor in the development of this model. In my mind, there can be no doubt that the Christian values and beliefs that drove her to become an avowed sister of St. Joseph are integrated at the core with the Roy adaptation model. And there was a quote from her that I think it kind of puts this whole thing into perspective. Adaptation can be viewed as a process and outcome whereby thinking and feeling persons, as individuals or in groups, use conscious awareness and choice to create human and environmental integration for the betterment and unity for all human beings. So this is a continuation, a little more explanation of the main concepts, the meta-paradigm factors of this model. So the person is a biopsychosocial being in constant interaction with the changing environment. That person uses innate and acquired mechanisms to adapt. An adaptive system described as a whole is really comprised of many parts, and an individual defined as a whole with parts that function as a unity for purpose. And really, if you weren't listening to some of the other stuff, this is probably difficult to follow, but it really is the basic viewpoint of Roy as to adaptation of human beings. So below, adaptation, responding positively to environmental changes, the process and outcome of individuals and groups who use conscious awareness, self-reflection, and choice to create human and environmental integration for the greater good of everybody. So the environment. The environment is defined in her model as all conditions, circumstances, and influences that surround and affect the development and behavior of humans, and that can be an individual person or groups, as adaptive systems with a particular consideration of human and earth resources. The stimulus represents the elements, whether internal or external, that interacts and arouses a response in a person. So the internal and external environment define the set of stimuli that interacts with the person in Roy's model. There are three classes of stimuli: focal, contextual, and residual. The three types of stimuli act together and influence the adaptation level, which is a person's ability to respond positively in a given situation. And a person's adaptation level may be described as integrated, compensatory, or compromised, depending on the effect and how they respond to an environmental stimulus. So this goes into a little more depth about that. So a focal environmental stimuli is defined as the internal or external stimulus most immediately confronting and challenging the person's adaptation. Because of this, the focal stimuli is the most important as it directly deals with the person, forcing their attention on the stimuli. The contextual stimuli is defined as all other stimuli existing in the current situation that contributes to and strengthens the effect of the focal stimulus, which is the behavior. And then the residual stimuli are any other stimuli phenomena arising from a person's internal or an external environment that may affect the focal stimulus, but whose effects may be unclear or indeterminate on that person's behavior. So again, more of the main concepts. So health is the state and process of being and becoming integrated and whole. Inevitable dimensions of a person's life represented by a health-illness continuum. And that's unfortunately the sad reality for all of us as human beings. We certainly seek and hope for good health, but the reality is we will have illnesses, conditions, and diseases at various points during our life that can have profound changes on who and what we are. So the goal of nursing, to enhance life processes to promote adaptation, with adaptation being the process and outcome of thinking and feeling individuals who use conscious awareness and a choice to create human and environmental integration. Nurses also seek to promote adaptation for individuals and groups in the four adaptive modes, thus contributing to health, quality of life, and dying with dignity by assessing behaviors and factors that influence adaptive abilities and by intervening to enhance environmental interactions. So a person does not, in this slide, we're going to start discussing the subsystem that follows the main concepts. So a person does not respond passively to environmental stimuli. The adaptation level is modulated by a person's coping mechanisms and control processes. Roy categorized these coping mechanisms into either the regulator or cogenitor cognator subsystems. So the coping subsystems are stimulate, activate innate and acquired coping mechanisms to respond to environmental changes. So as a regulator, a basic type of adaptive process that responds to stimuli automatically through neurochemical and endocrine coping channels. So we're thinking and looking at autonomic reflex responses that involve chemical, neural, or endocrine neurotransmitters. The cognator is a major coping process that receives stimuli and responds to them by involving 4 cognitive emotive channels, which is perceptual and information processing, learning, judgment, and emotion. So a second aspect of these coping subsystems is, and they actually coincide with the regulator and cognator subsystems, are the stabilizer and innovator subsystems. So the stabilizer subsystem refers to the established structures, values, and daily activities whereby participants accomplish the primary purpose of the group and contribute to the common purpose of society, such as people manufacturing goods and going to work and making money to support their families. The stabilizing subsystem is typically worked with and I'll go back the slide, with the regulator system, while the cognator system is usually paired with the innovator subsystem, which refers to cognitive and emotional strategies that allow a person to change to a higher level of potential. So this is kind of a generalized picture of Roy's adaptive model. You can see that we've got the different types of environmental stimuli on the left and how those stimuli coming in are managed. That moves to the coping processes, the regulator stabilizer subsystem and the cognator innovator subsystems, which then in turn address and interact with the adaptive modes, which are physiological, the physical, the self-concept or group identity, and culture, role function, and interdependence. And then depending on the adaptation level, that adaptation for that person may be integrated, compensatory, or comprised. And there is an absolute feedback loop from one side to the other. So let's talk about these major components of adaptation. There's 4 of those. So I just mentioned them: physiologic, which is the physical, self-concept and or group identity, role function, and interdependence. And this is kind of a chart that integrates that into that pictorial for Roy's adaptation model. And again, you can see how they are all interlinked with coping processes to respond to stimuli, and on the other side, the responses are the person's behaviors. And those are based on adaptation. So the physiological mode, behavior in this mode is a manifestation of the physiological activity of all the cells, tissues, organs, and systems of the body. The physiological adaptive mode refers to a way a person responds as a physical being to stimuli from the environment. So there are 5 physiological needs in this mode, which they include oxygenation, nutrition, elimination, activity, rest, and protection, which are put together. And then there are 4 complex processes that mediate the regulatory activity of this mode, which are the senses, fluids, and electrolytes, neurological function, and endocrine function. So physiological integrity is the adaptive response in this adaptive mode. The self-concept mode refers to a psychological and spiritual characteristics of the person. So a person's self-concept consists of all the beliefs and feelings that has formed about oneself from internal perceptions and from perceptions of others. The self-concept changes over time and guides one's actions. So the self-concept incorporates 2 components, the physical self and the personal self. So psychic integrity is a goal of this self-concept mode. So this is kind of a deeper explanation of the physical self and personal self. The physical self is how we see ourselves as physical beings. So body sensation, it's the ability to express sensations, feel symptoms. Our body image is how we see ourselves as a physical being. The personal self is how one views his qualities, values, and worth. So self-consistency is one self-description of qualities, and it also includes self-organization behaviors. The self-ideal self-expectancy is what one would like to do or be. And the moral, ethical, spiritual self is our value systems, beliefs, religion, and religion self-esteem. So it's a value we place on ourselves. The role function model involves the position one occupies in society and the behaviors associated with that position or role. A role as a functioning unit of society is defined as a set of expectations about how a person occupying one position behaves towards a person occupying another position. In other words, do we treat them equally? Do we look down on them? Do we elevate them? Social integrity is the goal of the role function model. The role function model includes primary roles, secondary roles, and tertiary roles, which in essence is the various type of roles we may take on in life. We may have an occupation as a family nurse practitioner. We may be a husband or a wife in a marriage. We may be a father to or wife to mother to children. All of those encompass those roles. So the interdependence mode refers to the coping mechanisms arriving from our close relationships that result in the giving and receiving of love, respect, and value. So in general, these contributive and receptive behaviors occur between the person and their significant other, which would be the spouse, ourselves and a spouse, parent, or God, or between the person and his support system, which are our less intimate relationships, such as with friends and coworkers. So affectional adequacy is the goal of this mode. And giving behaviors under this mode include love, nurturing, and affection. And receiving behaviors under this mode include receiving or taking in love, nurturing, and affection. So this, again, is a simplified model of Roy's adaptation system. And it's really just a rehash of what we've talked about with the stimuli, coping processes, the various effectors, which are the adaptive modes we just went through, and the final output, which is the adaptive and either effective or ineffective responses. And I mentioned earlier that there is an absolute feedback loop from one side to the other that continually cycles as we adapt and change. So this is an interesting example of Roy's adaptation model, where the left column represents environmental subsystems. So you're looking at contextual stimuli, focal stimuli, residual stimuli, and they just generically looked at this in regard to setting up an advanced directive or a living will. So on the contextual stimuli, they look at health insurance and satisfaction with their health care, their general income. The focal stimuli is when they end up in a hospital or nursing home situation. The residual stimuli are those ones that are unclear how they may affect it, but age, gender, race, education level. So our adaptation modes, the physical mode is activities of daily living, history of falls, the number of diagnoses. Our self-concept mode is looking at our self-reported health and how our health is. Our role function mode is our working status or if we're volunteering, and our interdependence mode is the family structure, number of living children. All of this ties together to create an adaptive decision-making response to a living will or an advanced directive. It's kind of an intriguing way to look at it. So Roy's adaptation model for the nursing profession and nursing practice is obviously a core part of this whole adaptation. So it is useful in all areas of nursing practice, from acute care to primary care, and has been the basis of research questions to develop basic and clinical nursing science for people of all ages in health and illness, whether it be acute, chronic, or terminal. So nursing practicing with and utilizing Roy's adaptation model would generally be seeking the following, hopefully: greater knowledge of factors that either promote or hinder adaptation, better methods and tools for assessing adaptation behaviors and levels, specific nursing interventions that either promote or hinder adaptation, and effective methods of evaluating adaptation as an outcome of nursing care. So, for the nursing profession, Roy's adaptation model can be used as a research platform, as a way to gain nursing scientific knowledge for both practice and skills and tasks. It can provide clinical assessment and interventions. It can be used to guide the nursing practice. It can be used to organize a nursing education, which it's been used extensively for. And it can also be used as a curriculum framework for various nursing colleges. So we're just kind of continuing this theme of how Roy's adaptation model affects the nursing practice. So the nursing process is a goal-oriented, problem-solving approach to guide the provisions of comprehensive, competent nursing care to a person or groups of persons. According to Roy, the nursing process relates directly to the view of the person as an adaptive system. So the goal of nursing under the Roy model is to promote adaptation in each of the 4 adaptive modes: the physiological, self-concept, role function, and interdependence adaptive models or modes. Roy has conceptualized the nursing process to comprise 6 simultaneous, ongoing, and dynamic steps. So these are a first-level assessment, second-level assessment, diagnosis, goal setting, the intervention, and evaluation. So we're going to kind of talk a little bit about these. So assessment of behavior is the first level assessment. So behavior is an action or reaction under specified circumstances, and behavior may be observable or not. The nurse observes behaviors, which can be signs and symptoms or responses of the patient, and makes a judgment as to whether the behavior is adaptive or ineffective. The second step is assessment of the stimuli. So stimuli are the underlying causes or factors contributing to the behaviors observed in the first level assessment, those things which provoke a response. Normally, a person adapts to stimuli positively, maintaining a steady state of health. But in times of stress, when coping mechanisms are overwhelmed, i.e. an illness or disease, the person's ability to adapt to a new situation is impaired. So the third part is nursing diagnosis. A nurse's education and experience enable him or her to make an expert judgment regarding healthcare and adapting needs of the client. This judgment is expressed in a diagnostic statement that indicates an actual or potential problem relating to adaptation. The diagnostic statement specifies the behaviors that led to the diagnosis and a judgment regarding stimuli that threaten or promote adaptation. So in Roy's model, they define the nursing diagnosis as a judgment process resulting in statements conveying the adaptation status of the human adaptive system. So the next fourth part of this nursing process is goal setting. So goal setting focuses on promoting adaptive behaviors. Together, the nurse and the client agree on clear statements about desired behavioral outcomes of nursing care. The outcome statement should reflect a single adaptive behavior, being realistic and being measurable. The goal statement should include the behavior to be changed, the change expected, and the time frame in which the change in behavior should occur. The fifth nursing process is intervention. So intervention focuses on the manner in which goals are attained. A nursing intervention in any action, or is any action taken by a professional nurse that he or she believes will promote adaptive behavior by the client. So nursing interventions arrive from a solid knowledge base and are aimed at the focal stimulus whenever possible. Intervention is any nursing approach that is intended to promote adaptation by changing the stimuli or strengthening the adaptive process. So managing and changing of the stimuli include altering them, increasing, decreasing, removing, or maintaining a stimuli. And for a family nurse practitioner, this also integrates very nicely with a traditional medical model of treatment. So the last and sixth part is the evaluation. So in Roy's model, evaluation consists of one question: has a person moved towards adaptation, i.e. moved towards health? Evaluation requires that analysis and judgment be made to determine whether these behavioral changes stated in the goal statement have or have not been achieved by the recipient of the nursing care. In the evaluation phase, the nurse judges the effectiveness of the nursing intervention that may have been implemented and determines what degree the mutually agreed upon goals have been achieved. So there was a section on this about why this particular theory was chosen. So in our particular course, we were actually assigned particular theories, but Roy's adaptation model is one I've used, certainly not to the extent I've learned in my research for this presentation, but have used in my nursing practice since the very beginning. So as future family nurse practitioners, as a future FNP, my goal is to provide care for patients in the primary care setting. My intention is to be the best healthcare provider I can be so that my patients receive excellent care and experience exceptional outcomes. I believe the best way to achieve this level of success is by integrating and using Roy's model nursing theory as the basis for my primary care practice. So Roy's model provides me with a powerful tool that I can use to promote adaptation for my patients and their families using the 4 adaptive modes that we previously discussed. The adaptation modes, combined with Roy's model techniques for interviewing, assessment, examination, diagnosis, and determination of a treatment plan, will provide me with a framework to provide consistent, high-quality care while promoting my patients' health and quality of life. And I would add that Roy's adaptation model provides a consistent framework and approach that facilitates critical thinking and analysis in patient care. The very structure and nature of the model, with its main concepts, subsystems, and adaptation modes, provides the healthcare provider with a mechanism to sort through the many levels and layers of a patient's life and health history to determine the causative focal point stimuli that has led to their illness and disease. So I present a case study as part of this presentation, and we're going to go through this fairly quickly. A 50-year-old male presents to your primary care clinic as a new patient with a chief complaint of general fatigue and intermittent headaches for the past several months. This gentleman is 5'10" tall and weighs 232 pounds. His past medical history is positive for a tonsillectomy as a child and a left arm humeral fracture at age 20 and obesity. His family history: his father is alive with a history of hypertension, obesity, and diabetes mellitus. The mother is also alive with a history of obesity and hyperlipidemia. And he has 2 younger brothers with a history of obesity and hyperlipidemia and dyslipidemia. And you'll notice the reoccurring theme here. The patient denies a history of smoking of any type, states he drinks an occasional beer approximately twice a month, and states his exercise is from walking at work, where he's a warehouse foreman. He is married with 2 grown children who do not live at home. He admits to poor dietary habits, eating fast foods 2 to 3 times a week, and his primary diet consists of fried foods, deli sandwiches, steaks, and potatoes with daily portions of potato chips at lunch. He eats sweets for snacks, cookies, or candy bars. He states that he only feels that his health is fair and he wants to make major changes to his lifestyle, and that's critical in the treatment of anybody. So he had no known or stated allergies. His blood pressure was 152/90, which is hypertensive. Pulse rate 74. Temp was within normal limits, as was his O2 status. So for his height and weight, his BMI is 33.3, which places him in the obesity category, and actually very close to being morbidly obese. His only medications are a daily vitamin and occasional use of Motrin, Advil for low back pain. No labs were done. They're pending at this time. The physical examination findings were generally negative, except as noted above for blood pressure, weight, and BMI. The diagnosis for this patient is hypertension. The new prescriptive treatment for this is losartan 25 milligram tablet once daily and hydrochlorothiazide diuretic 25 milligram tablet once daily. So applying Roy's adaptation model to this adult patient with hypertension, we look at the environmental stimulus. So the focal stimuluses are general fatigue and intermittent headaches, his signs and symptoms. Contextual is obesity, poor dietary habits, and the residual would be his age, gender, race, and occupation. His coping processes: this is the regulator stabilizer. His compensatory and homeostatic responses to hypertension from the neurologic, cardiovascular, renal, and hormonal system, they're compromised. You add to that he knows he needs to continue to work to support his family, and that stabilizing factor is in jeopardy. The cognator innovator factors, or cognitive understanding that something is wrong, and his concern and fear over what may be happening, fear of the unknown illness or disease. And he knows he must be seen by a doctor to get answers. So the 4 adaptive modes here, the physiological, physical, he suffers generalized fatigue and intermittent headaches. Self-concept, he perceives that something is wrong, feelings of concern and worry. He's ending up with an altered image of himself because he is not feeling well, which lowers his self-esteem. His role function is he's very concerned that whatever is wrong with him could cause him to lose his job, as he is the only provider in his family. And that relates to the interdependence mode below. He has a family to support and know they rely on his paycheck to pay for their basic needs. So we have 3 levels of adaptation. So the integrated adaptation, compensatory, and compromised. And in his particular case, he's at a compromised adaptation state where the integrated and compensatory processes are inadequate, and he has an adaptive problem. He is in a disease or illness state. So his body essentially has failed to adapt to the hypertension, and he has become symptomatic. For the family nurse practitioner process and practice, one of the things would be looking at a priority for the diagnosis chain. So the patient, we know the stimuli, we know what's been going on with that. So from a diagnosis chain, the patient's symptoms have led to activity intolerance, increased stress, altered role performance, and body image disturbances. And the primary diagnosis, again, is hypertension. So the interventions on the physical side, vital sign monitoring, educating this patient about his condition and body responses, teaching self-care techniques, education about medications that will be the basis for his treatment, and then further down the road, weight loss, dietary changes, and other things that are crucial to helping him control his hypertension. On the mental intervention, initiating the social contact with the new patient and having a good bonding experience with them, providing emotional support, assessing his spiritual needs. I would certainly recommend he bring his wife to the next visit so she can understand what is occurring with him and be able to provide support and participate in sharing of his problem. So the final part of this would be an evaluation and follow-up. So at the end of the initial visit, the patient should have an understanding of the following: his diagnosis, what has been occurring in his body to cause his symptoms, an understanding of what may have caused the problem originally, an understanding of the treatment plan to effectively treat his hypertension. He should be receiving an education on the prescribed medications or side effects and a timeline of how quickly they'll work. He should also be educated on lifestyle changes, and during an initial visit, this will be very basic, but can be pursued more in depth in follow-up, and those would be things to facilitate controlling his hypertension, which would be weight loss, exercise, dietary changes, etc. Education would also include making sure he buys a blood pressure machine for home use and is using it and charting that every day, and also to schedule a follow-up appointment in 2 weeks to assess his progress. So in conclusion, Roy's adaptation model views persons as living adaptive systems whose behaviors may be classified as adaptive or ineffective. These mechanisms in this model work within 4 adaptive modes. The goal of nursing is to promote adaptive responses in relation to those 4 adaptive modes, using information about the person's adaptation level and various stimuli. And nursing activities involve manipulation of these stimuli to promote positive adaptive responses and good health. So these are just some general questions for the discussion board. Name and describe 2 of the philosophical assumptions of the Roy model. What are 3 of the scientific assumptions of the Roy model? Name and describe 2 of the explicit assumptions of the Roy model. Discuss 2 of the implicit assumptions of the Roy model. Describe 2 of the meta-paradigm concepts of her model. Describe 1 of the subsystems of the model. Name the 4 major components of adaptation and describe 1 in detail. Name and describe 2 ways that the Roy model applies to nursing practice. And then, do you believe that Roy's model is applicable for primary care, and explain why or why not? So again, I'm going to kind of finalize this with a picture again of the Roy model because it very succinctly puts it into the perfect perspective of how humans respond and adapt to various stimuli. So at the end of this, we just have our references. Feel free to review those, and thank you for following this presentation.